We all inherit more than just possessions from our parents. Some legacies are written in silence. This story might hit close to home. Watch until the end. You may see a part of yourself here. The morning my father's will was to be read dawned with an appropriate chill. Not the dramatic, cinematic kind that commands attention, but the quiet sort that settles into your bones when you've been standing too long in one place. I'd been doing exactly that, standing outside Marjorie Kane's estate office for 20 minutes, watching familiar faces file in while pretending not to see me. Winter in New England has a way of stripping everything down to essentials. The trees stand naked against gray skies, the streets narrow under packed snow, and people hurry past with ducked heads and raised collars. Today was no exception. I adjusted my scarf and checked my watch again, though I knew perfectly well I was early. Force of habit, punctuality being one of the few traits my father had successfully imprinted upon me. Nathaniel Crane had been dead for 16 days. I learned of his passing through a voicemail from Marjorie, her voice carefully modulated into professional sympathy. "Elliot, I'm sorry to inform you that your father passed last night. Heart failure. The service is scheduled for Thursday." There was a pause, as if she expected the line to go dead. "He made arrangements years ago. Everything's taken care of." Everything except me, I had thought. I hadn't attended the funeral. 13 years of silence seemed impossible to break with a performative appearance at a graveside. Instead, I taught my Tuesday afternoon seminar on Dickinson as scheduled, discussing Death Slant with sophomores who'd mostly experienced it through cinema and distant relatives. Now, I watched Henry Mercer arrive in his gleaming black Audi, silver hair catching weak morning light as he nodded to someone through the office window. He'd aged well, in that way successful men often do, confidence masquerading as good genetics. He didn't notice me until his hand was on the door, and when he did, his face performed a complicated series of adjustments before settling on something like sympathy. "Elliot," he said, crossing to where I stood. "It's been too long." "Henry." I accepted his extended hand, noting how firmly he still gripped, how the heavy gold signet ring on his right hand pressed uncomfortably against my knuckles. "I suppose it has. Terrible business this. Just terrible." He shook his head, eyes downcast in a practiced display of grief. "Your father was a complex man, but a good one of the best I've known, despite his, well..." He glanced at me, the sentence hanging meaningfully incomplete. "His what?" I asked, though I knew all the possible endings. "His disappointments, his regrets, his failure with you." Henry smiled thinly. "His struggles, Elliot. We all have them." A young woman emerged from the office then, saving us both from further excavation of that particular conversational pit. "Mr. Mercer, Ms. Kane is ready to begin. And Mr. Crane," she added, barely meeting my eyes. "She asks that you wait until called." Of course she did. Henry gave my shoulder an avuncular squeeze. "See you inside, then." I watched him disappear into the warm interior, leaving me once again alone in the cold. I didn't mind, not really. The solitude felt appropriate, almost ceremonial. 13 years since I'd last set foot in this town. 13 years since my father had looked at me over the rim of his whiskey glass and said, "I expect you'll do what you want, regardless. You always have." He wasn't wrong. I'd done exactly what I wanted, left his carefully constructed world of property development and local politics for a teaching position in Chicago. What he never understood was that I'd spent the first 27 years of my life trying to be what he wanted, only to discover I had no idea who I was. The door opened again 40 minutes later. Marjorie herself stood there this time, her tall frame silhouetted against the light. She'd aged since I'd seen her last, silver threading through her dark hair, but her posture remained impeccable, her gaze direct. "Elliot," she said, and unlike the others, there was no performance in her greeting. "I'm sorry to have kept you waiting. Please, come in." The office was warmer than I'd expected, though the gathered faces weren't. Henry sat with his legs crossed, ankle resting on knee, while two other men, legal representatives I assumed, flanked him like expensive bookends. Another woman, vaguely familiar from my childhood, occupied a chair near the window. No one spoke as I removed my coat and took the single empty chair. Marjorie returned to her position behind a large oak desk that I remembered from childhood visits with my father. How many times had I sat in this room, drawing quietly on legal pads, while the adults spoke in low, serious tones about matters I didn't understand? "As we've reviewed," she was saying, shuffling papers into a neat stack, "the distribution of assets is straightforward. The company holdings transfer as stipulated in the previous agreements." She nodded to Henry, who returned a solemn nod of his own. "The monetary assets have been allocated per Nathaniel's instructions, with the charitable foundation receiving the specified percentage." She continued for several minutes, outlining distributions and requirements, legal language flowing smoothly from her as if she were reading poetry. My name wasn't mentioned. I hadn't expected it to be. Then, as the others began to gather their things, Marjorie cleared her throat. "Elliot, if you wouldn't mind staying a moment." Henry paused, curiosity evident in the slight tilt of his head, but Marjorie's expression revealed nothing. Eventually, he and the others filed out, the door closing behind them with a soft click that nonetheless felt definitive. "I think you know why I've asked you to stay," Marjorie said once we were alone. "Actually, I don't." My voice sounded strange to my own ears, too controlled. "I didn't expect to be included in the will." She studied me for a long moment. "You weren't, at least not in the formal document we just reviewed." I nodded, unsurprised, and yet still feeling something small and sharp lodge beneath my ribs. "However," she continued, reaching into a drawer, "Nathaniel left this for you, along with an addendum that requires your attention." She placed a sealed envelope on the desk between us, my name written across it in my father's precise, slanted handwriting. Beside it, she laid a document bearing the official letterhead of her firm. "What is it?" I asked, not reaching for either. "The letter is private. The addendum concerns the disposition of the house on Maple Street." The house, my childhood home, the colonial with the peeling blue shutters and the creaking third stair. I hadn't thought about what would happen to it. I assumed it would be sold, with proceeds going to the foundation or whatever. Marjorie's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "That was the original plan. This addendum would change that, but it requires your signature. It was drafted by your father approximately 8 months ago, but never signed." "I don't understand." "It stipulates that the house would pass to you, with certain conditions." I felt a laugh building somewhere in my chest, though there was nothing remotely humorous about the situation. "He drafted it, but never signed it? That seems fitting." "Nathaniel was a complicated man, Elliot. So everyone keeps saying, as if complexity excuses cruelty." The words came out sharper than I'd intended, but Marjorie didn't flinch. Instead, she slid both items closer to me. "I suggest you visit the house before making any decisions about the addendum. Take some time. There's no rush. The property is secure." I stared at the envelope, at my name in that familiar hand, and felt a strange vertigo sweep through me. How many times had my father written my name in official documents? Birth certificate, school records, bank accounts. But how many times had he addressed something directly to me? I couldn't remember a single instance. "Why are you telling me this now, instead of during the reading?" Marjorie considered her answer carefully. Because your father specifically requested it be handled privately. Always concerned with appearances. I meant it to sound biting, but it came out tired instead. Perhaps, she conceded. Or perhaps he understood that some matters are better discussed without an audience. I took the envelope and document, tucking both into my coat pocket without opening either. Thank you, Marjorie, for everything. As I stood to leave, she added, the key is under the flower pot by the back door. It always was. Outside, the cold hit me again, but differently now, more insistent somehow. The sky had darkened during my time inside, threatening snow. I walked back to my rental car, my footsteps crunching on salt-scattered pavement. I hadn't planned to visit the house. My intention had been simple: attend the reading, tie up any loose ends, return to Chicago by evening. But now, I found myself driving familiar streets, muscle memory guiding me through turns I hadn't navigated in over a decade. Maple Street hadn't changed much. The same austere houses lined the road, set back behind winter-brown lawns and dormant gardens. I slowed as I approached number 47, half expecting it to have transformed in my absence. But there it stood, exactly as I remembered. 3 stories of faded colonial dignity, with shutters that had once been Wedgwood blue, but now flirted with gray. The driveway was clear, but the walkway unshoweled, as if no one expected visitors. I parked and sat for several minutes, engine running, heat blasting against the growing chill outside. What was I doing here? What could possibly be gained from this pilgrimage? The house represented everything I'd left behind: expectations unmet, words unspoken, a life unlived. And yet, I killed the engine and stepped out, the cold air shooting through my lungs like a warning. The late afternoon light cast long shadows across the snow-dusted lawn as I made my way around to the back of the house, where a forgotten path led to the kitchen door. Sure enough, the terracotta pot still sat beside it, though the geraniums my mother had loved were long gone. I upended it, finding the key exactly where Marjorie had promised. The lock turned with surprising ease, as if recently oiled. The door swung open on silent hinges, revealing the kitchen I'd known intimately once, now stripped of life, but instantly, painfully familiar. The old butcher block island where I'd done homework, the copper-bottomed pots hanging above it that we never used after my mother died. The window above the sink that framed the oak tree in the yard, like a painting that changed with the seasons. I stepped inside, the door closing behind me with a soft click that echoed in the empty room. The house felt cold, not just in temperature, but in essence, abandoned, though meticulously maintained, like a museum dedicated to a life no one celebrated. As I moved through the kitchen into the dining room, a memory unfurled before me, so vivid I nearly gasped. I am 10, maybe 11, sitting at the long mahogany table with a plate of something my father has heated up. Not cooked. Nathaniel Crane doesn't cook. He heats things up, or he orders in, or, most often, he isn't there for dinner at all. Tonight is rare. We sit across from each other, the table stretching between us like a no-man's land. "How was school?" he asks, not looking up from the document beside his plate. "Fine," I answer, though it wasn't. Tommy Mercer, Henry's son, had knocked my science project from my hands as I carried it into class. "An accident," he'd claimed, while Mr. Peterson helped me gather the broken pieces. "Sorry, Crane." My father nods absently, turning a page. I push peas around my plate and wonder if I should tell him about the upcoming parent-teacher night. Mrs. Abernathy specifically mentioned she'd like to discuss my writing with him. Dad. Still not looking up. Never mind. He glances at me then, a brief assessment, then returns to his reading. We finish dinner in silence. I blinked, and the memory receded, leaving me alone in the empty dining room. Dust motes danced in the weak light filtering through heavy curtains. I moved through the first floor like a ghost, not touching anything, simply observing. The formal living room with its uncomfortable antique furniture. The study, door ajar, revealing the massive desk where my father had spent countless evenings. It was there, in the study, that I finally removed the letter from my pocket. I didn't sit in his chair, couldn't bring myself to, but perched instead on the leather ottoman near the cold fireplace. The envelope opened easily, revealing several pages covered in the same precise handwriting as the outside. Elliot, if you're reading this, then I've failed in yet another way. I had intended to speak with you directly, but time, it seems, has run out. Some would call this cowardice, writing what should be said face to face. They wouldn't be wrong. I stopped reading, my hands suddenly unsteady. Through the window, I could see snowflakes beginning to fall, delicate and hesitant at first, then with growing conviction. I folded the letter back into the envelope. I wasn't ready, not here, not yet, not with the ghost of my father so present in this room. As I stood to leave, something small and metallic fell from the envelope, landing with a soft clink on the hardwood floor. I bent to retrieve it, an old brass key, small enough to fit a desk drawer or a jewelry box. I turned it over in my palm, wondering what it might open, what further mysteries my father had left behind. The snow was falling more heavily now, casting the world in a soft, diffuse light. I should leave, return to my hotel, book the first flight back to Chicago tomorrow. That had been the plan. Simple, clean, final. Instead, I pocketed the key and the letter and made my way upstairs. If I was to understand what my father wanted from me, even now, I would need to stay, to read, to remember, to face what remained of our shared past in this house of echoing silence. The staircase creaked under my weight, each step releasing a familiar symphony I could have conducted blindfolded. Third step from the bottom, a sharp whine. Seventh step, a deep, resigned groan. The top step, silent, as if holding its breath. How many times had I navigated these stairs in darkness, learning their language to avoid waking my father? I reached the second-floor hallway, hesitating at my father's bedroom door. It stood slightly ajar, as if he had just stepped out momentarily. I pushed it open. The bedroom was exactly as I remembered, austere, tidy, with military precision to the made bed. On the dresser sat 3 framed photographs. My mother's portrait, taken a year before her death, my parents' wedding day, and unexpectedly, me at my doctoral graduation, a photo clipped from the university newsletter. I had no memory of sending this to my father. I hadn't even known he was aware of my graduation. The bedside table drawer was partially open. Inside lay a leather notebook filled with my father's hurried handwriting. Spoke with ease department chair today. He's being considered for early tenure. Pride isn't the word. Elliot's article in the literary journal came today. Had to look up half the references to understand it, but his analysis of silence in Hemingway, he sees what others miss, like his mother that way. I closed the notebook, startled. My father had written about me, had thought about me, had perhaps missed me in his own contained way. The brass key from the envelope weighed heavy in my pocket. It fit perfectly into the lock of my mother's bedroom door, which had remained closed since her death when I was 10. The room was frozen in time. Dust had settled on surfaces untouched for years. The 4-poster bed still wore the blue and white quilt my grandmother had made. The vanity table held my mother's silver-backed hairbrush, a few strands of dark hair caught in the bristles. On the bedside table sat a small wooden box I didn't recognize. Inside was a collection of peculiar treasures, a smooth stone, a pressed flower, a theater ticket stub, and a folded piece of lined paper covered in childish handwriting, my poem from 4th grade that I thought he'd dismissed. The Oak Tree by Elliot Crane, age 9. The oak tree stands alone. Its branches reach for sky. I'd shown it to my father, hoping for praise. He'd glanced at it and said, "Interesting imagery, but trees don't cry, Elliot. Remember that metaphors should maintain logical consistency." I'd thrown it away that night. Yet here it was, carefully preserved among what appeared to be my father's private treasures. I reached for his letter again, settling onto my mother's bed to read. "Elliot, I am not a man of easy words. Your mother was the one who knew how to speak from the heart. I've spent a lifetime translating emotions into actions, believing that provision was its own form of love. I was wrong. After Catherine died, I lost more than my wife. I lost my interpreter. Without her, I retreated into what I knew: work, routine, measurable success. I told myself it was enough, that by securing your future financially, I was doing what a father should. What I failed to understand was that you were your mother's son in all the ways that mattered. You needed words, Elliot. Acknowledgement. The very things I found most difficult to give. The day you told me you were declining the position at Mercer and Crane, I saw myself through your eyes, a man you needed to escape. It was a mirror I couldn't bear to face. Last year, when I received word of your consideration for tenure, I felt a pride that surprised me. You had built something meaningful without my help. You had become a man I didn't fully understand, but could nonetheless admire. I began drafting changes to my will. The addendum would leave the house in your care, not as an obligation, but as an acknowledgement that some legacies are worth preserving, even when imperfect. I never signed it. Fear stopped me. Fear that you would reject it, as you'd rejected so much else. Fear, too, that acceptance would require a conversation I didn't know how to have. The key enclosed opens the drawer of your mother's vanity. Inside you'll find an unsigned copy of the addendum, along with things I've kept for you over the years. I failed you not through absence of feeling, but through inability to express it. In my own inadequate way, I have always been proud to call you my son. Your father, Nathaniel. I moved to the vanity table and opened the drawer with the key. Inside lay the addendum, along with newspaper clippings chronicling my academic achievements, reviews of conferences where I'd presented, publication announcements, even the small feature when I'd won the teaching award. He had been following my career, collecting evidence of my life from afar. A knock at the front door startled me. I made my way downstairs to find Claire Addison, snowflakes caught in her dark hair. "I heard you were back," she said. "Marjorie called." We settled in the living room, where I built a fire. Claire looked good. The softness of youth had given way to more defined features, her once nervous energy now steadier, more deliberate. "Your father changed, Elliot. Especially this last year," she said. "He started coming to community events, donated to the library, asked about you." "Asked you about me?" She nodded. "We ran into each other downtown. He wanted to know if we were still in touch, if I knew how you were doing in Chicago." "What did you tell him?" "That I had no idea if you were happy, but that you were doing work you believed in." He seemed to like that answer. Claire reached into her bag, withdrawing an envelope similar to the one I'd received. "He wrote to me too, about 6 months ago. Asked me to give you this if you ever came back and he wasn't here." I took the envelope, but didn't open it. Why would he write to you about me, after all this time? I think he was trying to put things right, in his own way. This place was important to him, to your mother. I think he wanted it to stay in the family. "I'm not sure I am family anymore," I said, the words catching in my throat. Claire looked at me directly. "Family isn't just what you're born into, Elliot. It's what you choose to keep, even when it's difficult, especially then." After she left, promising to return tomorrow, I sat before the fire holding the second envelope. The snow continued to transform the landscape outside, covering old tracks, creating a canvas for new ones. By morning, I would need to decide about the addendum, about this house and the legacy it represented. But for now, I allowed myself to listen to my father's voice as it emerged from the silence between us. Morning arrived with uncompromising brightness, sunlight reflecting off fresh snow and pouring through windows I'd forgotten to close the curtains on. I lay still for several moments, disoriented by the unfamiliar ceiling above me. I had fallen asleep in my father's study, the leather chair reclined, Claire's envelope still unopened on my chest. Now, as consciousness fully returned, I felt the stiffness in my neck, the weight of decisions waiting to be made. Today was meant to be my last in town, the rental car due back, my flight to Chicago scheduled for late afternoon. The practical infrastructure of my departure remained in place, even as my intentions had shifted beneath me like sand. I sat up, my father's second letter sliding into my lap. I'd read it twice before exhaustion had claimed me. Unlike the first, with its measured consideration, this one felt rawer, less controlled. Elliot, I asked Claire to give you this because there are things I couldn't write until I knew I wouldn't have to face your response. Even now, with my health declining and the doctors speaking in euphemisms, I find myself unable to say these things directly. The addendum to my will is not a peace offering or manipulation. It is an acknowledgement. This house was never simply mine to give away. It belonged to your mother, to you, to the family we were, however imperfectly. When you left 13 years ago, I told myself it was your choice, your rejection. But we both know I had already pushed you away long before. After Catherine died, I couldn't bear to see her in your face, to hear her in your questions. Every time you reached for connection, I retreated further into work, into silence. I realize now what it must have cost you to grow up in that silence. How loudly my absence must have spoken. If you're reading this, then I've lost the chance to tell you directly. I am sorry, Elliot. Not just for the years of estrangement, but for all the moments before that, when I failed to see you clearly. The house is yours if you want it. Sell it, keep it, burn it to the ground. The choice should be yours, as so many choices in your life were not. I have made many mistakes. Loving you was never one of them, even when I couldn't find the words to say it. Your father. The letter held no grand revelations, no dramatic confessions, just a simple truth that felt both insufficient and overwhelming. He had loved me, in his way, and had known it wasn't enough. I folded the letter carefully and placed it with the others, then made my way to the kitchen. The house felt different in morning light, less a mausoleum, more simply a home that had outlived its occupants. I found an ancient jar of instant coffee in a cupboard and boiled water on the stove, the familiar ritual grounding me in the present. Cup in hand, I wandered through the downstairs rooms, seeing them with new eyes. The formal living room with its uncomfortable antique sofa where guests rarely sat. The dining room table where silent meals had stretched into eternity. The study with its walls of books my father had read but rarely discussed. In each space, I now noticed small details that complicated my memories. A throw pillow my mother had embroidered, still in its place on the window seat. A chess set, permanently arranged mid-game, that my father and I had abandoned one winter evening when I was 14, never to be resumed. Photographs I'd forgotten existed, school portraits tracking my growth, snapshots from events I barely remembered, all displayed with quiet persistence. The doorbell rang, startling me from my observations. Claire stood on the porch, arms laden with grocery bags, her breath visible in the cold morning air. "I wasn't sure you'd still be here," she said as I took some of the bags from her. "Flight's not until 5. I led her to the kitchen, where we unloaded bagels, coffee, eggs, and other basics onto the counter. "Though I'm not sure I'm taking it." She glanced at me, a question in her eyes, but didn't push. Instead, she began preparing breakfast with familiar ease, finding pans and utensils as if she'd been in this kitchen recently. "You've been here," I said, realizing, "since he got sick." She nodded, cracking eggs into a bowl. "Someone needed to check on things, make sure the heat stayed on, that pipes didn't freeze. Marjorie asked if I would mind." "And you didn't?" "No." She whisked the eggs with practiced movements. "I didn't." "Why?" Claire paused, considering the question with the same thoughtfulness I remembered from our youth. "At first, because Marjorie asked, and it was the right thing to do. Then, because—" She hesitated. "Because I started finding things. Notes he'd written about calling you. Lists of your publications he'd printed out. Half-drafted letters never sent." "A whole life lived in silence," I murmured. "Not silence, exactly." She poured the eggs into the heated pan. "More like a different language, one you didn't speak." We ate breakfast at the kitchen island, sunlight streaming through windows that needed cleaning, the world outside blindingly white and untouched. Claire didn't press me about my plans, instead sharing stories about the town, her teaching, the small changes that had accumulated during my absence. It felt strangely comfortable, this reconnection across years, as if we were picking up a conversation merely paused, rather than abandoned. After she left, extracting a promise that I'd call before making any final decisions, I found myself drawn back to my mother's room. The small wooden box of treasures sat where I'd left it, along with the unsigned addendum. I picked up the legal document, skimming its formal language. The house would come to me with no conditions, no strings, simply mine to keep or dispose of as I saw fit. All it required was my signature where my father's should have been. I returned downstairs to the study, document in hand. On the desk sat a framed photograph I hadn't noticed the night before. My father and me at a fishing pond when I was perhaps 7, both of us solemn-faced but standing close, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder. I didn't remember the photograph being taken, didn't recall the fishing trip at all. How many other moments had slipped away, lost in the narrative I'd constructed about our relationship? The unsigned addendum seemed to hover between us, between the father and son in the photograph and the reality we'd lived. I couldn't sign it. Not yet. There was something else I needed to find first. I spent the next hour methodically searching the study, pulling books from shelves, checking behind paintings, looking for any hiding place where my father might have left one final message. Nothing revealed itself. Frustrated, I returned to my mother's room, to the vanity drawer the brass key had opened. Perhaps I'd missed something. The drawer contained nothing new, just the newspaper clippings and a few old photographs I hadn't examined closely. But as I started to close it, I noticed a small catch at the back, the wood slightly uneven. I pressed it, and a hidden compartment at the rear of the drawer slid open, revealing a small tape recorder. My hands trembled slightly as I lifted it out. The device was old, the kind that used tiny cassettes, but when I pressed the play button, it whirred to life. My father's voice filled the room, hesitant and low. "Elliot, I don't know if you'll ever hear this. I'm not even sure why I'm recording it, except that Dr. Simmons suggested—" "Well, that doesn't matter. I've never been good with words. Not like you. Not like your mother." A long pause, filled only with the sound of breathing. "I want to tell you why I kept your poem, the one about the oak tree. You were 9, and when you showed it to me, all I could think was how much you reminded me of Catherine. The same way of seeing the world, finding meaning in things I took for granted. I didn't know how to tell you that it frightened me, how deeply you felt things. I was afraid I'd fail you the way I failed her at the end." Another pause, longer this time. I've spent a lifetime building things meant to last. Buildings, businesses. But the only thing that truly matters is what I built with you and your mother. And that's the very thing I let crumble. I'm sorry, Elliot, for all the words I never said, for all the times you needed more than I knew how to give. The recording ended abruptly. No closure, no final words of wisdom. Just a man struggling to express what came so difficultly to him. I sat on the edge of the bed, tape recorder in hand, unexpected tears blurring my vision. My father had tried, in his way. Too late, perhaps. Too little, certainly. But he had tried. I returned to the study, the unsigned addendum in one hand, pen in the other. Before I could reconsider, I signed my name in the space where his should have been. It wasn't forgiveness, exactly. It wasn't forgetting. It was simply an acknowledgement that legacies are complex things, neither fully embraced nor fully rejected, but carried forward, transformed by our own understanding. The doorbell rang again as I set the pen down. This time, it was Marjorie, her tall frame outlined against the bright white world outside. "I thought I'd check on you before you left town," she said, stepping inside. Her eyes took in the study, lingering on the signed document on the desk. "I see you've made a decision." "Yes." I picked up the addendum and handed it to her. "Will this be enough? Legally, I mean." She examined it briefly, then nodded. "It's unusual, but with your signature acknowledging your father's intention, we can make it work." She tucked the document into her briefcase. "What will you do with the house?" I glanced around the study, at the books that had shaped my father's thinking, at the desk where he'd written letters never sent, at the photograph of us that I'd forgotten existed. "I'm not sure yet. Keep it, maybe, at least for now." Marjorie nodded, something like approval in her eyes. "Your father would be pleased." "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe he'd think it was a sentimental decision." There are worse things to be than sentimental about the right matters, Elliot. After she left, I called the airline to cancel my flight, then the university to arrange coverage for my classes for another week. There was work to be done here, sorting through rooms of memories, deciding what to keep, what to let go. It wouldn't be finished in a day or even a week, but it was work I now understood I needed to do. That evening, as twilight settled over the snow-covered town, I sat at my father's desk, my desk now, and began to write. Not to him, not to anyone in particular, but simply to capture the shifting landscape of memory and understanding that had emerged these past 2 days. The silence between fathers and sons can stretch across years like winter shadows across snow. We learn to navigate it, to build our lives around its presence, until we can almost forget it's there. Almost. My father was a man of few words, but many thoughts. I never learned to read the language of his silences, to understand what lay beneath the surface of his reserve. Or perhaps I learned too well, building my own silences in response, two people speaking volumes by saying nothing at all. Today, I found his voice, recorded, halting, human. It didn't repair what was broken between us. No single moment could. But it offered something I hadn't expected, the recognition that silence doesn't always mean absence. Sometimes it's simply the space where we haven't yet learned to speak. Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft flakes catching the last light of day. Inside, I continued to write, filling pages with thoughts long suppressed. I wrote about my mother's death and the void it left, about my father's retreat into work and mine into books, about the anger I'd carried and the understanding that now tempered it, about Claire and the possibilities that lingered between us, unspoken but not extinct. I wrote until the room grew dark, until the only light came from the small desk lamp casting my shadow against the wall. Longer now, different, but still recognizably shaped by the man whose chair I sat in, whose house I now occupied, whose blood ran in my veins. When I finally stopped, hand cramped and mind emptied, I realized something fundamental had shifted. This house, once a monument to absence, now felt like a beginning rather than an end. The rooms still held their ghosts, the walls their silent witness, but they were mine now to fill with whatever voice I chose to develop. I closed the notebook and placed it in the desk drawer, alongside my father's letters and the tape recorder with his halting confession. Then I rose and moved through the darkened house, switching off lights, checking locks, small rituals of caretaking that felt both foreign and familiar. In the morning, Claire would come again. We would continue the work of sorting, deciding, remembering. Henry Mercer would call about business matters that needed attention. Marjorie would file the paperwork making the house legally mine. Life would resume its forward motion, carrying me along in ways I couldn't yet foresee. But for now, in this quiet house filled with snow-reflected moonlight, I allowed myself to simply be present with all that remained. The tangible legacy of furniture and photographs, yes, but also the intangible inheritance of silence and its breaking. The spaces between words that, in their own way, spoke volumes. The signature left unspoken, but finally, belatedly acknowledged. I climbed the stairs to my childhood bedroom, each step creaking its familiar song beneath my weight. Tomorrow would bring decisions, actions, forward movement. Tonight was for recognition of what had been lost and what, unexpectedly, had been found. Not reconciliation, exactly, but something equally valuable. The understanding that even in absence, we continue to shape each other's lives. That inheritance is not just what we're given, but what we choose to keep.